Well, it's good to see you guys. Thanks for being here this evening, for prioritizing this corporate worship gathering. We're really glad to be able to be here together. We have 2 Sundays until ResCon. Anybody excited about that? Yeah. ResCon coming up soon. So 2 available Sundays. And in these 2 Sundays, kind of like Brian said in the welcome, we want to do a short series on a part of the Bible that we don't get to talk about very much. So we typically tend to preach a little bit more from the New Testament than the Old Testament. And then even in our time in the Old Testament, it's pretty rare that we would spend any time in the prophets, the prophets. So Old Testament prophecy is broken into 2 major sections. You have the major prophets and you have the minor prophets. That's how it's typically broken down. The major prophets, the big long books, are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Lamentations. And then the minor prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And so in these 2 weeks, we don't have near enough time to cover one of the major prophets. And so I wanted to spend these weeks covering one of the most important and profound minor prophets that we have never worked through as a church since our church started 6 years ago. And so we're going to spend the next 2 weeks in the book of Hosea. Hosea is the longest of the minor prophets, 14 chapters total. We are not going to work through the entire 14 chapters. Obviously, there's a lot in there, but we will cover the primary themes, the teachings, the ideas of the book of Hosea. So to start out, I want to ask you guys a little bit. What do you know about Hosea? Tell me, like off the top of your head, what do you think about when you think of the book of Hosea?
Hosea in the highest.
Okay, lyrics from a song. Yep.
Redeeming Love.
Yep, Francine Rivers.
Yeah.
If you haven't read Redeeming Love, you should read it tomorrow. It's great. What else? What do you think of? Prostitute, okay? If you don't know anything about Hosea, now you're pretty curious about what's going on. Anything else come to mind?
The language is pretty scandalous.
Scandalous language in the book of Hosea, yes. That is true. That's true of a lot of the prophets, but it's particularly true of Hosea, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So, everything you guys said is accurate. There is a book called Redeeming Love. It's kind of a Christian fiction based on the story of Hosea. It's an amazing book. You should pick it up. Hopefully this series will inspire you to go pick it up. It's great. But there is a prostitute as a main character in this book, and it gets pretty interesting in the way that God frames that storyline out. So by the end of this series, by the end of these 2 weeks, we will all have a much fuller, clearer picture of this beautiful and challenging book. I was reading the New American Commentary on Hosea, and I love this. This is a paragraph from the introduction. I want to read this to you guys. He said, "Hosea is not an easy book. It begins with a prophet receiving a command to marry a prostitute and promptly describes the births of his 3 children, each of whom is given a bizarre but significant name. From here, the book swiftly plunges into a maze of warnings, microsermons, poems, and laments, and through them all it swiftly and evasively alludes to biblical texts and incidents, mixes metaphors, and changes topics seemingly at random. But though Hosea is a difficult book, it's also a great book. It is a book that jolts the reader. It refuses to be domesticated and made conventional. It does comfort the afflicted, but it most surely afflicts the comfortable. It is as startling in its presentation of sin as it is surprising in its stubborn certainty of grace. It is as blunt as it is enigmatic. It is a book to be experienced, and the experience is with God." I thought that was an excellent introductory paragraph to this book, especially that sentence, "It does comfort the afflicted, but it most surely afflicts the comfortable." I think we'll find that today. Some of the shocking language, the imagery that God uses will shock some of us, will afflict some of us in our comfortable states. So let's talk about some basic hermeneutics. Since we rarely spend time in the prophets, we need to remember some principles of hermeneutics. Now that's just a fancy word that means the study of how to interpret the Bible and other sacred texts. Hermeneutics is how to study the Bible, how to interpret the Bible and other ancient texts. So depending on what genre you're reading, what era of the Bible you're reading from, your hermeneutical method is going to change slightly. But here's a really simple overview of basic hermeneutics. You could apply this to any text in the Scriptures, and it's going to be helpful for you. So basic hermeneutics, and this is in your handout here, 4 steps. Step 1, observe their home. You open to a text, Observe their home. What do I see? You just read it. Read the text. What does it say? So you're not interpreting anything. You're just seeing what it says. Step 2 is understand their home. What does it mean? What does this text mean? What's the context? What's the background? What did this text mean to them, and how did it apply to them? And so if you're reading an Old Testament prophet, like we're going to today, it takes a little bit of work to figure out what this verse meant to some particular Jewish tribe 3,000 years ago. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to bridge that gap, but that's what we're going to have to do in this sermon series. Step 3, bring it back home. So now you're asking the question, how does it relate? We have to identify the timeless principle that's being communicated in the text, and then bring it into our present day, our present culture, our present world. So how does the principle relate to us now? And step 4, finally, apply it in your home. What do I do about this timeless principle? How do I apply it in my life, in my context? So 4 steps. These steps are important. Here's why. For example, let's say you read Hosea chapter 2, verse 1. Here's what that verse says. It says, "Say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters, you have received mercy." Now, if I don't know anything about hermeneutics, and I read that text, I don't know if you can pull that, oh yeah, it's at the bottom there. If I read that text and I skip to step 4, then what I'm going to do as a faithful, obedient Christian, I'm going to pull out my phone and text my little sister, "You have received mercy." Right? Because it says, tell your sisters you have received mercy. So that would be my application of that text. Is that the proper application of that verse? No, obviously not. That has nothing to do with the application of that verse. We don't have a clue what that verse is even about yet. Who is speaking here? Who is being spoken to? Who are the brothers and sisters? If you don't go through a proper hermeneutical method, if you don't go through these steps, you will misunderstand and misapply the Bible constantly. So we first have to make sure we understand what the text means in its original context before we can ever try to apply it, identify the timeless principles, and then apply it in our lives. So when we dive into a book like Hosea, we're going to spend most of our time in steps 1 and 2, and then toward the very end, we finally get to steps 3 and 4 and apply it into our lives. Does that 4-step process make sense to everybody? Okay, so let's start with some historical background. The book of Hosea is a collection of about 25 years worth of writing. Okay? He didn't sit down all at one time and write this whole thing. 25 years worth of writing from the prophet Hosea. Hosea lived in about the mid-8th century BC. So we're talking 2,700 years ago approximately, which was the time of the divided kingdoms. You might remember this, that the people of God in this time, they were divided between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Here's a map of it right here. Northern kingdom, Israel. Southern kingdom, Judah. Now, Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. He was in Israel. He was not in Judah. And during this time period, Israel was engaged in lots of idol worship. Idolatry, idol worship. They were surrounded by other nations who worshiped other gods, and some of those gods had seeped into the worship of the Israelites. In particular, the Israelites were worshiping the Canaanite god Baal. Baal, B-A'-A-L, 2 syllables. Here's a couple images of Baal. Baal was the storm god in the Canaanite pantheon. He was a storm god, so he controlled the rain, therefore he controlled the fertility of the crops, things like that. In both of these pictures, you can see he's holding a lightning bolt. That's that thing in his hand. He's the storm god holding the lightning bolt. So that was the main Canaanite god that they were committing idolatry with. At this time, Israel was ruled by King Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam was a very successful military commander, but he led Israel into rampant idolatry. He was the one that led them into the worship of Baal. 1 Kings 14, verse 9 says this about Jeroboam. It says, "You have done more evil than all who lived before you." That's quite a verse to be written about you. "You have made for yourself other gods, idols made of metal. You have aroused God's anger and turned your back on God." It's written about King Jeroboam. So here's the context of the book of Hosea. Israel, the people whom God has chosen and blessed and rescued and delivered, is being ruled by a wicked, idolatrous king who has led the people to worship idols and false gods. That's the historical context that this book was written into. And God sends the prophet Hosea to the Israelites to proclaim judgment and destruction upon them for their sin. And he also comes to reaffirm his covenant promises to them. So judgment and destruction, and then reaffirm his covenant promises. That's the content of the book of Hosea. So this book it's roughly divided into two sections. The first 3 chapters are a narrative about the prophet Hosea and his marriage to Gomer. And then the final 10 chapters, 4 through 14, are all poetry. It's all poetry. About 90% of it is scathing judgments and indictments against Israel for her sin. And then about 10% is God's promise to bless them and save them despite their sin. That's the last 10 chapters. So today we're going to preach through this first section, the first 3 chapters, the narrative section, and then next week we will cover the poetry, which is going to be, I think, quite a bit more challenging for us, both because we are unaccustomed to dealing with biblical poetry and we are unaccustomed to dealing with the severity of God's judgment against sin. So next week will be, I think, a little bit of a challenge for us and for me to preach through. But that's pretty much all the background, the historical context, the structure of the book, everything we need. But I do want to make one more note. This is related to what Haley said a few minutes ago. One more note before we get into this text that's specifically relevant for Hosea, but I think it's helpful for all of us as we read all of the Bible. We need to have a conversation about what do we do with blunt, crass, or shocking language in the Bible. How do we handle it? How do we think about that stuff? Believe it or not, the Bible does contain shocking language. A lot of it has been softened by our English translations over the years, but sometimes you can still see it shine through. So for instance, in Philippians chapter 3, Paul says that he has suffered the loss of all things, and he counts them as skubala. That's the Greek word, skubala. Now, your Bible probably translates that as rubbish. Count it all as rubbish. But in the Greek, it actually means excrement, human excrement. It means maybe a 4-letter word that starts with S. That's what Paul is saying when he says skubala. I count all of it as skubala. That is a vulgar and shocking use of language. Isaiah 64 verse 6 says that our righteous deeds are like filthy rags. But in Hebrew, that word is much more vulgar. It's menstrual rags. It's tampons. That's what Isaiah is saying our righteous deeds are before God. Matthew 22, Jesus calls the religious leaders snakes. Now, think about the use of the word snakes in the Bible. What is a snake referring to? It's the devil, right? The serpent is the devil in the garden. So Jesus goes to the local Jewish temple and tells the rabbi, you are the devil. He calls them a demon. Jesus does that. In Matthew 15, Jesus calls a Canaanite woman a dog, which was a racial slur used by Jewish people to Gentiles. Jesus uses that language. In Galatians 5, Paul says that he wishes that those who were obsessed with religious rituals would emasculate themselves. I don't know if you remember that verse when we preached through Galatians. Paul literally says, in the Bible, I wish those guys would castrate themselves. That's in our Bibles, and we have to figure out what to do with it. Ezekiel says so many things that are so vulgar and sexual. I'm not going to bring them up here. You could go look at them later in your own Bibles. But we need to figure out, what do we do with texts like those? Especially when the Bible also commands us to let no unwholesome talk come out of our mouths. The Bible commands that of us, and yet it has all of this language in it. So how do we deal with the vulgarity, the crassness of those texts? Well, here's a logical syllogism that we could keep in mind. A syllogism is a statement of logical facts that flow one to the next. So here's the sequence. God is holy and good. Everybody affirm? Thumbs up there. God is holy and good. The Bible was written under the inspiration of the Spirit of God. Okay? God inspired the Bible. We all affirm still? Logic flows. Therefore, the Bible is holy and good. God's holy and good. He wrote the Bible. Therefore, the Bible is holy and good. Affirmed? The Bible contains crass language. We just walked through a handful of examples. We could give a whole bunch more. Therefore, crass language can be holy and good. That's how you finish that syllogism. It is sometimes good and holy and righteous to use crass, vulgar, or shocking language for specific purposes. That's what we need to see. Now, I want to be really quick to say, it is usually bad and unholy and destructive to use crass and vulgar and shocking language. Okay? Hear me say that. Usually not a good thing, but they can be used for good. You could think of this kind of language like a really spicy pepper. Okay, so every once in a while, you're making a dish. It's nice to throw in a really spicy pepper. Bring some heat out, add some kick to it, wake people up, accent some other flavors in the dish. But if every dish was just spicy peppers, it would be inedible and poisonous, right? It'd be bad for everybody involved. So this kind of language has to be used selectively, carefully, and occasionally to bring out certain themes or to cause certain things to happen. As Christians, we should absolutely not be vulgar shock jocks. That is not what a Christian should be. But at the same time, we should also not buy into the lie that all vulgar or shocking language is automatically bad. Okay? Those are both ditches that we can't fall into. I remember once when I was in college, and I went to my pastor, Matthew Young, and I confessed some serious sin to him. And so we talked through it for quite a while, and then he pulled me into a hug, and he prayed over me, and during his prayer, he cussed multiple times. During his prayer with me in a hug, Matthew was expressing righteous anger over my sin, and he was trying to jar me out of my complacency with that sin. He was trying to shock me into righteousness. That was a good and holy use of vulgar language. So, why do I bring all this up in this sermon? Well, the narrative that we read today is all about the marriage between Hosea and an adulterous wife, who the Bible frequently calls a whore or a harlot. So we're going to use those words a lot today because the Bible uses them a lot. Those are shocking, jarring words. Just because they're in the Bible does not mean that it's okay for you to leave this place and start using them in your daily vocabulary. You shouldn't be calling people these words just because the Bible uses them. That would obviously be inappropriate, unrighteous use of language. But they are in the Bible for a reason. The point of this story is to shock the Israelites into seeing the gravity of their sin and the immense love that God has for them. That's the reason this language is in there. The book of Hosea uses a metaphor of a whore to jar people into understanding reality. That's why this word is used over and over. Therefore, this language is perfect and good and righteous, even though it is crass and vulgar. This is actually a fairly common theme in the Bible. The prophets use the term whore over 60 times to describe how Israel has acted like an unfaithful wife to God. It's fairly frequent language that we find in Scripture. So the Hebrew word translated whore is zanah. Zanah, Z-A-N-A. In English, a whore we automatically associate with prostitution, like exchanging sex for money. Zanah was not necessarily that specifically. It was more like fornication or adultery. That's more of what that word meant. It's about giving yourself sexually to someone who is not your spouse. That's what's being implied by zanah. So let's get into this text and let our understanding of both the historical context and the strategic use of shocking language guide us into the meaning of this passage. Sound good? We ready? All right, so chapter 1, verse 1. Let's jump into it. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So this, verse 1, places us in the right historical context. So during the reign of King Jeroboam, that puts us about 790 to 750 BC. We know exactly where historically this is happening. Verse 2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." Imagine that being the first time you hear God speak to you. The first thing he says, go marry a whore, have kids with her. I don't know what you guys would do. God, why? Why do I have to do this? Because Israel has been a whore to me, and I'm going to use you as an illustration. That's God's purpose for Hosea. Hosea is a better man than I am. He doesn't hesitate. Verse 3, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. And I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So Hosea marries Gomer. They have a son, and God gives them instructions to name him Jezreel. There's a little more context. Jezreel was a valley between Galilee and Samaria, and it was in the valley of Jezreel that King Jehu defeated the armies of Ahab and Jezebel, who were wicked idolaters. You can read about 2 Kings 9 and 10 recounts the battle of Jehu against Ahab and Jezebel in the valley of Jezreel. So God tells them to name their son Jezreel because he will, quote, punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's think through it. Jehu went to war in the valley of Jezreel, and he went to war to battle idolaters. Now, the house of Jehu, the Israelites, have become an idolater. They have become the exact thing that they went to war to defeat. So God is going to punish the house of Jehu, the Israelites, because they have become the enemy that their forefathers defeated in the valley of Jezreel. So one son is named Jezreel because God will punish the Israelites for their idolatry. Verse 6, she conceived again and bore a daughter. And the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy, for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. Hosea and Gomer, they have a daughter. They name her No Mercy because God will have no mercy on Israel. He does say he will have mercy on Judah. Remember, that's the southern kingdom. Israel's the northern kingdom, but not on Israel. Verse 8, when she had weaned No Mercy, she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said, call his name Not My People, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. One final child, a son, named Not My People, because the Israelites are no longer God's people. So far, this has been a dark and tragic chapter, right? God is using the family of Hosea to illustrate his relationship with Israel. The wife is an adulterous whore, and the children represent judgment, mercilessness, and abandonment. This is a dark chapter so far. But before the chapter ends, we see a ray of hope shine through. In the prophets, in the prophet genre, this is called a reversal, where God pronounces judgment on the people because of their sin, and then reverses and promises blessing because of his faithfulness. This happens often in the prophets. So verse 10, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. So God finishes chapter 1 by reminding them of the Abrahamic promise. I will make your people more numerous than the stars in the sky and the sand on the shore. And he promises that he's going to gather all of his people from Judah and Israel and unite them under one coming king. Who is that king? Christ. There we go. This is church. It's always the answer. You can just yell Jesus anytime. Jesus, the Messiah from the line of David, is the coming king that all the people will be united under. So chapter 1 ends with a reaffirmation of God's covenant to Abraham and a promise of the coming messianic king. In chapter 2, we are back to Hosea. So evidently between chapters 1 and 2, Gomer has abandoned Hosea and she has gone off with other men. In Redeeming Love, you remember the scene where she flees her husband and goes to live in the whorehouse in San Francisco. She went off to go live with other men, and this chapter starts with Hosea telling his 3 children to go and plead with their mother, who is off playing the whore. So here's what we read. Chapter 2, starting in verse 2. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked, and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have no mercy, because they are children of whoredom. For their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. So Hosea is proclaiming judgment and punishment upon Gomer for her unfaithfulness. And gradually, as this poem goes on in chapter 2, it changes from the metaphor of Hosea to Gomer into the actual relationship between God and Israel. It's not a real smooth change. It just gradually turns into that type of language. So you'll see it here. We'll jump down to verse 10. The poem continues and says, now I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. And I will put an end to all her mirth, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed feasts. Obviously, this is talking about Israel now. And I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. And I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she burned offerings to them, and adorned herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers, and forgot me, declares the Lord. So because of Israel's covenant unfaithfulness, because they have played the whore, they deserve punishment and judgment. That's what's due to them for their sin. But then again, in chapter 2, we have a reversal at the end, where God promises them future blessing because of his faithfulness, in spite of Israel's sin. So verse 14, therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by name no more. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God. God promises that because of his covenant faithfulness, someday he will remove the curse, restore the relationship, and reverse the names that he has given to Hosea's children. Because of their idolatry and sin, the Israelites deserve punishment and discipline and forsakenness, but because of God's love and God's faithfulness, they will receive mercy and redemption. In chapter 3, the narrative of Hosea and Gomer comes to a climax in this powerful display of what God will do with his people. So remember, at this point in the Hosea and Gomer story, Gomer has run off with other men. She is playing the whore. She has abandoned her family. She's in the possession of another man. Chapter 3, verse 1. And the Lord said to me as Hosea, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. So God commands Hosea to go and rescue Gomer, the woman who has abandoned him, cheated on him, dishonored him. Hosea must offer payment for the woman who has stolen from him. Hosea must sacrifice for the woman who has afflicted him. Do you see the gravity of this marital dynamic? And all of this is a metaphor for God's redemption of his people who have rejected and betrayed and devastated him. They have turned to other gods. This isn't in my notes, but I know many of you are married. Just for a second, imagine this. Imagine this playing out in your own marital relationship. Like, get the gravity of this situation. It's unbelievable, the imagery that's being played out here. This verse ends with cakes of raisins. Cakes of raisins were a special dessert eaten as part of Baal worship. So that's what's going on there. Specifically, they were part of cultic orgies. They believed that raisins had aphrodisiac qualities, so they would eat cakes of raisins. That's why this is included in this verse. You can eat raisins if you want to. That's not idol worship. Verse 2. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethech of barley. And I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. Hosea pays for his adulterous wife and brings her back home. And chapter 3 ends with this. Chapter 3 ends with a close of this whole metaphor. Verse 4. For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So again, God promises that through his faithfulness, the faithless people will one day be redeemed and restored under a coming messianic king. So that's our text for today. Hosea chapters 1 through 3. I know that was a lot of reading. You did a great job. That's a lot of verses. But we are now done with hermeneutics step 1. Observe their home. We have seen the text. And now it's time to move into step 2. We need to understand their home. What do these chapters mean? What do these prophecies mean? What does the life and marriage of Hosea mean to those people? What's the point? Well, here's a few observations that should be fairly obvious to us at this point, because we've been talking about them as the text has been read. Here's 4 observations. Number 1, Hosea and his unfaithful wife Gomer are a metaphor for God and his unfaithful people Israel. We all tracking there? All followed that observation? Number 2, just as Gomer committed adultery against Hosea by giving herself to other men, Israel committed adultery against God by giving herself to other gods. Tracking there? Number 3, because of her adultery, Gomer/Israel deserve punishment and rejection. Because of the adultery, they deserve punishment and rejection. And number 4, because of his mercy and faithfulness, Hosea/God pays the cost to rescue his wife and bring her back to a covenant relationship with him. That's the point of the storyline. That's the point of the narrative in Hosea chapter 1 through 3. That's what the text meant for them. Now, step 3, we have to bring it back home. We have to identify the timeless principles that are being communicated in this story. So I'm going to ask for a little more crowd interaction here. What is the timeless principle being communicated about idolatry in this story? What is the timeless principle about idolatry that's being communicated?
Idolatry is a sin.
Idolatry is a sin, yep.
God hates idolatry.
God hates it, yep. Let's drill down on that even more. What kind of sin? What is it related to?
A replacement of God.
Yeah? Right, it is a replacement of God. What else? What do you guys think?
Unfaithfulness.
Right. Idolatry is, it's not just any generic sin, it is unfaithfulness to God. It is adultery before God. It is playing the whore to our God. So here's how I wrote it. This is in your notes. Idolatry betrays God's love and breaks God's heart. Just like an unfaithful spouse, idolatry betrays God's love and breaks God's heart. And then second, what's the timeless principle being communicated about God's character? What do you think we could say about God's character from this story?
He's just kind of like, what the hell, man?
Yeah. Right, he responds to our sin. He doesn't ignore the sin. What else?
He's still merciful.
He's still merciful. Yep. In spite of our sin, in spite of our rebellion, in spite of our adultery, God is still merciful. So here's how I wrote it. Though God's people are faithless and idolatrous, God is faithful and merciful. We are faithless and idolatrous. God is faithful and merciful. So those are the eternal, universal, timeless principles that are being communicated in this story. Those two things are true of every person, every place, all time. Idolatry is a heartbreaking betrayal. But though God's people turn against him, he never forsakes them. That is true forever. So that's step 3, identify the timeless principles. And finally, step 4, apply it in our home. How do those principles, those two statements, apply to us today? Well, we need to figure out what are the main differences between our context and theirs. Well, what's the main difference over the last 2,700 years? Well, one significant difference between the time of Hosea and today is that in Hosea's day, God's people were the Israelites, the Jewish people, right? An ethnic chosen people. Today, we know that God's chosen people are Christians, the elect, a spiritual group consisting of people from all tribes and tongues and nations. Those are God's people. So when we apply that timeless principle to today, we have to recognize that God's people means us. It means you and me today. It means the church. When we are faithless and we are idolatrous, God is faithful and God is merciful. So that's one bridge that we have to cross. God's people are us. Here's another big one. What major historical event happened between 750 BC and today? Jesus, there we go. Jesus, right? The messianic king that God foretold about in Hosea has now come. He has paid the price for us. He has ransomed us from our slavery to sin. He has made a way for us to be redeemed. He has reconciled us to himself. Though God's people, Christians, are faithless and idolatrous, God has been faithful and merciful by sending his own Son to pay for our sins and give us eternal life. Hosea was looking forward to a coming Messiah, but we are looking backwards at a Messiah who has come. But with those two things in mind, that we are God's people and Christ has come, let's look at our timeless principles again and draw an application from each of them. So 2 timeless principles. Idolatry betrays God's love and breaks God's heart. Though God's people are faithless and idolatrous, God is faithful and merciful. The way we apply that first timeless principle is by taking stock of our own idolatry. Take stock of our own idolatry in our lives. If idolatry is this big of a deal to God, if it breaks his heart like an adulterous spouse breaks their partner's heart, then we should all probably take our idolatry much more seriously. We should examine our lives for that idolatry. Now, I doubt that any of us have like a shrine to a Canaanite god set up in our basement that we're making sacrifices to. Our idolatry looks different than theirs did back then, but we all have false gods that we give worship to. We all have false gods that we give worship to. To use the shocking language of Hosea, we are all playing the whore with false gods. We give our devotion, our affection to a false god. So, some questions for you. What idol, what pleasure, what pursuit do you allow to be on the throne of your life? What desire guides your decision-making processes? Have you given your worship to the god of success? Climbing the corporate ladder to get a higher and higher paying job? Have you given your worship to the god of recreation, sacrificing your responsibilities so you can enjoy your hobbies or sports? Have you given your worship to the god of pleasure, indulging in a destructive lifestyle just because it gives you momentary dopamine hits? Well, what is it that you prioritize or you rely on more than your relationship with God? And sometimes, I found this in my own life, it can be hard to see our idols until we get practical about our lives. So here's a couple practical diagnostic questions. What do you spend your free time doing? What do you spend your discretionary money on? Oftentimes your calendar and your bank statement are the clearest signs of your idolatry. What do you spend your free time on? What do you spend your discretionary funds on? What causes you to feel your strongest emotions, like fear or anger? Usually those emotions come up when our idols are threatened. What controls your decision-making process? And what are your if-onlys? So if only blank, then my life would be better. If only blank, then my life would be better. What goes in the blank for you? What idol are you placing there? Take stock of your own idolatry, because that idolatry is unfaithfulness to God, who created you and purchased you with his own blood, and it breaks his heart like an adulterous spouse. Let's take stock of our own idolatry. The way we apply the second principle is by giving praise and honor to God for his mercy and faithfulness. Well, we don't have any action here except for being faithless and being the adulterous wife in this situation. So our response to God is to give thanks to him for who he is. We deserve punishment and destruction, but God continually provides mercy and forgiveness. While we are in rebellion against him, he sent his son to earth to pay our debt and rescue us from ourselves. And as such, God is worthy of our continuous, unending, eternal worship. This is why we thank him in our prayers every day. This is why we come to church every week and we sing the same songs to the same God every single week. He's worthy of it. This is why when we die and go to heaven, we will surround the throne and praise him all day, every day, forever. We will sing praises to God because he's infinitely worthy of our praises. So this story, Hosea and Gomer, it should cause us to thank God for his mercy. That's what should be in our hearts as we read this story. And here's the interesting thing about these two applications. Number 2 fuels number 1. Number 2 fuels number 1. Our love for God, our praise of God, our reverence for God is the fuel that helps us root out sin and idolatry in our lives. If we try to cleanse ourselves of our sin in our own power, we don't stand a chance. But if we hold our sin up to the disinfecting light of the gospel, it doesn't stand a chance. May we be people who live in constant praise to the God who is forever faithful. And may that praise overflow in our lives, causing holiness and faithfulness in us. That's my prayer for us today. Would you pray with me?